Nobody told me that mourning was going to stay with me for the rest of my life. I was just standing there, muddy boots, half a granola bar in my hand, wind cutting through my jacket like it had a grudge against me personally, when I saw him. A boy, maybe 10, 11 years old, walking with a group of adults who clearly had no idea what they were doing on a mountain, but he did. You could see it in the way he planted each foot, deliberate, careful, like the ground was something worth respecting. I didn't know who he was at first, or maybe I just didn't want to believe it. But then one of the other hikers near me, a woman from Edinburgh, I think, she had a red scarf. She grabbed my arm and said, very quietly, like she was afraid saying it too loud would make it disappear, "Is that George?" And I looked again. And yeah, it was. You have to understand something about the Scottish Highlands in late October. It is not a place that makes allowances for anyone. Not for tourists with expensive gear and no experience. Not for seasoned walkers who get overconfident on a clear day. And certainly not for royal schedules or media timelines or whatever PR calendar someone in Kensington Palace had been carefully managing for the past 6 months. The Highlands don't care about any of that. The weather shifts like a mood. You can be standing in pale gold sunlight one minute and then inside a cloud the next, the whole world gone white and cold, the path under your feet suddenly unclear. The peaks up here, we were near the Cairngorms, just south of the Lecht Pass, on a trail that the local mountain rescue volunteers know like the backs of their hands. Those peaks have been here for 300 million years. They were old before Britain was a country. They'll be here long after all of us are gone. That is what the Highlands teach you if you're paying attention. Humility, the right kind of smallness. I had driven up from Glasgow the previous night. I'm a freelance outdoor journalist. I write for a couple of hiking magazines and occasionally for a Sunday supplement if they need something about trail conditions or gear reviews. My editor had tipped me off about the hike weeks before. "Something's happening in the Cairngorms," she'd said. "Some kind of charity event. Could be interesting. The palace is keeping it quiet, but our contact says it's worth showing up." She hadn't told me who was going to be there. I'd assumed it was some minor royal, an aunt maybe, a cousin, someone doing their quiet civic duty, boots barely scuffed, back in London by dinner. I pulled into the small car park at the trailhead just after 7 in the morning. There were already a handful of vehicles there, a couple of Land Rovers with no markings on them, which in my experience means either very serious walkers or security services, and sometimes both. A minibus from a local outdoor education charity. A mobile unit that looked like it might be carrying medical equipment. The light was that specific Highland gray, not dark, not bright, just pewter, flat and still and honest. I signed in at a small registration table. A woman handed me a high-visibility wristband and a laminated information card. The card said the hike was in aid of Cairngorm Mountain Rescue Team, a volunteer organization that operates out of Aviemore, often going out in conditions that would make your stomach drop just reading about them. The money raised was specifically for new safety equipment, thermal imaging cameras, updated radio gear, emergency bivouac kits. "How far is the route today?" I asked. 14 miles, the woman said. She said it the way Scots say things, matter of fact, no drama, but with a little edge underneath that told you 14 miles in this terrain was not the same as 14 miles anywhere else. I laced my boots tighter and joined the group gathering near the start of the trail. There were about 40 people in total, I'd estimate. Some were clearly volunteers from the rescue team. You could tell by how they moved, easy and unhurried and watchful. Some were local, invited supporters. A few looked like they were there in some kind of media or comms capacity, though nobody had cameras out yet and nobody was making announcements. And then, just before 8 o'clock, 3 more Land Rovers pulled into the car park. The whole atmosphere changed. Not loudly, no one gasped or screamed. It was more like a gentle electricity, the kind you feel before a storm. People just became a little more upright, a little more alert. A man in a wax jacket stepped out of the second vehicle and spoke quietly to the registration woman. Then a door opened on the third vehicle, and a woman I recognized. One of the Wales household staff. I'd seen her photograph in a press briefing once, stepped out and turned back to help someone down. And then there was a boy. He was wearing a navy blue fleece, dark green waterproof trousers, proper walking boots, not shiny, not new. You could see they'd been worn before, broken in the right way. He had a small rucksack on his back, the kind of pack that tells you the person wearing it has actually thought about what they need and packed it themselves. He stood at the edge of the car park and looked up at the trail ahead. I want to be precise about this moment because I've thought about it a lot since. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look like he was performing. He looked the way any kid looks when they're about to do something they've been genuinely looking forward to. A little quiet, a little focused, like he was saving something up inside him for what was coming. One of the rescue team leaders, a tall man named Fraser, I found out later, who has been leading Cairngorm rescues for over 20 years, walked over and extended his hand. The boy shook it. No hesitation, just shook it properly like he'd been doing it since he was old enough to stand. And then he said something, I couldn't hear what, and Fraser laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. That was the first moment I thought, this kid is going to be okay up here. The group assembled at the trail marker. Someone from the mountain rescue team gave a brief safety briefing about sticking together, about what to do if the weather turned, about the emergency protocols. The boy stood at the edge of the group and listened. He didn't fidget. He didn't look at his shoes. He listened the way you listen when you actually want to know the information being given to you. I was positioned maybe 15 feet away, far enough to be discreet, close enough to observe. We set off just after 8. The first mile of the trail is a steady incline through a pine corridor, old Scots pine, the resinous smell of them heavy in the cold air, the light coming through in long diagonal shafts. The ground underfoot is soft with decades of needle fall, and you have to watch for roots. It's not dramatic terrain, but it demands attention. The boy walked near the middle of the group, which surprised me. I'd expected him to be at the front, performing keenness, or at the back, held back by security. Instead, he was just in the group, part of it. He was walking alongside a young woman, early 20s, I'd guess, who I later found out was a volunteer with the rescue team's youth outreach program. Her name was Ailsa. She had a cheerful, matter-of-fact manner that clearly worked well with young people, and she and the boy talked as they walked. Not continuously, they walked in comfortable silence sometimes too, which is the sign of a good hiking companion. But occasionally one of them would say something, and the other would respond, and there'd be a little flash of animation between them. I caught a few fragments. He asked her how many rescues the team had done this year. She told him she thought it was around 60. He asked what the hardest one was. She thought about it for a moment, properly thought, didn't just give a quick answer, and then she said something about a group of students who'd gotten caught above the quarry in a whiteout last February. 3 of them. They'd been out there for 11 hours before the team got to them. The boy was quiet after that, processing it, I think. Then he said, "Were they all right?" And she said yes, they were. Cold and frightened, and one with mild frostbite, but alive. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere important. By mile 4, the weather had begun to do what Highland weather does when it wants to remind you who's in charge. The cloud had been building for a while. You could see it from the higher ground, a thick gray mass rolling in from the northwest, but it arrived faster than most of us expected. The temperature dropped about 4 degrees in the space of 15 minutes. The wind picked up, and with it came rain, not heavy at first, just that fine, relentless Scottish drizzle that doesn't seem like much until you realize it has found its way through every layer you're wearing. Some of the hikers started rustling for waterproof layers. There was that awkward pause and stop that happens in groups when the weather changes. People unsure whether to halt or keep moving, bags half opened, jackets being pulled over heads. The boy had stopped walking and was calmly pulling a lightweight waterproof from the top of his rucksack. He'd packed it in exactly the right place, accessible, not buried. He put it on without fuss, pulled the hood up, adjusted the drawstring, tucked his gloves into the cuff loops so he wouldn't lose them. Then he looked around at the group, noticed that one of the older volunteers, a man in his 60s, very fit but perhaps not anticipating the cold snap, was struggling to get his zip to close properly. The boy walked over. He didn't announce this. He just walked over and without making a thing of it, helped work the zip free from where it had caught on a piece of the lining. A small thing, 30 seconds. Then he stepped back and they both carried on. The older volunteer, I asked his name later and found out it was Gordon, retired teacher, been with Mountain Rescue for 8 years, told me afterwards. Asterisk, he didn't make any fuss about it, just did it. You not know who he was from that alone. That sentence has stayed with me. The route takes you up, around mile 8, onto a section of open ridge. No tree cover, just rock and heather and the sky pressing down. This is where it gets real. The wind on the ridge was something else entirely. Not dangerous. Fraser and his team had checked the forecast and made the call that morning that conditions were within safe parameters, but serious. Serious enough that you had to lean into it, had to watch your footing, had to actually think about every placement of every step. I watched the boy on that ridge. He walked slowly. Not because he was struggling, his breathing was controlled, his posture balanced, but because he understood that this was not the place to rush. He watched the ground ahead of him, chose his line carefully. When the path narrowed to maybe 2 feet wide with a steep drop on the left side, nothing catastrophic, maybe 15 feet, but enough to hurt, he slowed further still and took it one step at a time. At one point, a gust came through that was strong enough to make several people in the group stagger. I grabbed the arm of the person next to me out of instinct. The boy bent his knees, dropped his center of gravity, and waited it out. He didn't grab anything. He just became lower and steadier. Fraser, who was nearby, watched this. He told me later that he'd been prepared to call the group to a halt and wait out the gust, but by the time he'd opened his mouth, the boy had already done the right thing independently. He's been taught properly, Fraser said. Someone's taken time with him, you can see it. Around mile 10, there's a section of the route that involves what you might call a mild scramble. Not technical climbing, you don't need ropes, but you do need to use your hands, and there are some moves that require a bit of commitment, a willingness to trust your body on uncertain ground. There was a moment on this scramble that I don't think I'll forget. The boy had made it about 2/3 of the way up a short rock step, maybe 8 feet of slightly overhanging ground, when his left foot slipped. Not a catastrophic slip. The kind where your foot skids on wet rock and your weight shifts wrong for half a second. My heart stopped. I don't know why. He was fine, objectively. There were people below him who could have caught him if needed. He wasn't in real danger. But there's something about watching a child's foot slip on a mountain that reaches down into somewhere animal in your chest. He recovered instantly, shifted his weight back to his right foot, found a better hold with his left and continued up. No drama, no pause to compose himself, no look around to see if anyone had noticed. I had noticed, I think everybody had. At the top of the rock step, he sat down on a flat boulder and waited for the rest of the group to come up behind him. When one of the younger volunteers, a girl of about 16, there, as part of a youth engagement program, reached the top looking distinctly shaken, he shuffled along on the boulder to make room for her. "It's worse looking at it than doing it," he said. She laughed, relieved, I think, to be told it was okay to have found it hard. "Was it scary?" she asked him. He thought about it honestly. "A bit," he said. "But that bit in the middle, when you get your hand on that good hold, that bit feels brilliant." We reached the high point of the route, not a technical summit, but a broad, rocky plateau with a cairn that the rescue teams maintain, just after 1 in the afternoon. The cloud had partially lifted. You know how the Highlands do that, make you work, make you earn it. And then, just when you think you'll never see more than 20 feet in any direction, they open up. The view was extraordinary, miles and miles of it. The Cairngorm Plateau to the north, the river valley below, the shapes of other hills emerging from cloud like something being remembered. The boy stood at the cairn and looked out. I was maybe 20 feet back, giving him space. His security team was present but discreet. They'd been present all day. I just stopped noticing them after the first hour, which I suspect was rather the point. He stood there for a long time, not performing contemplation, just actually looking. Then he turned around and said to Fraser, who was standing nearby, "How often do you come up here when it's not a rescue?" Fraser smiled. "When I can," he said, "not as often as I'd like." The boy nodded. "I'd come up here a lot," he said, "if I could." There was a simplicity to it that hit me somewhere unexpected. Not sadness, exactly, just an awareness of something. The particular shape of a life where, if I could, asterisk is a phrase you learn early. After lunch, sandwiches, flasks of soup, the kind of camaraderie that only happens when people have shared physical effort. There was an informal gathering at the cairn. The mountain rescue team's fundraising coordinator gave a short speech about the equipment the money would go towards. Thermal imaging cameras that can find a person's body heat in total darkness. Radio systems that work in the narrow glens where signals die. Emergency foil bivouac bags that can mean the difference between life and hypothermia. The boy was asked to say a few words. He didn't have notes. He stood up, looked around at the people gathered, and spoke. He said he'd wanted to do this hike because he thought the work that mountain rescue volunteers did was extraordinary, and he wanted to understand something about what they faced. He said he thought understanding was important, that you couldn't really care about something unless you tried to see it from the inside. He said the ridge had been harder than he expected. He said that in a good way. He said he hoped the money raised would mean that the next group of students caught in a whiteout above a quarry, and here he glanced at Ailsa and she smiled, would come home safe. Then he sat back down. No applause prompted, no smile held for a camera. He just sat back down on the rock and ate the rest of his sandwich. We descended in the late afternoon, the light going golden the way it does in October in Scotland, everything amber and long-shadowed and slightly unreal. At the trailhead, the Land Rovers were waiting. The boy loaded his rucksack in, said goodbye to Fraser, a proper handshake again, and something exchanged quietly between them, and then got in. I stood there watching the vehicles pull away. The woman with the red scarf from Edinburgh appeared at my shoulder. "Didn't expect that, did you?" she said. I told her I hadn't expected any of it, really. She watched the last Land Rover round the bend in the track and disappear. "He'll be good at it," she said. "Whatever it is they need him to be, he'll be good at it." I walked back to my car. My boots were soaked through and my legs were heavy in the good way. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before turning the key. Outside, the Highlands were already going dark, the hills closing in, the first stars faintly arriving overhead. And I thought about a 10-year-old boy standing on a ridge in a 40-mile-an-hour wind, dropping his center of gravity and waiting it out. Some things you can't teach a person. They either have it or they don't, and the mountain always knows. There's a moment, about halfway up any serious climb, when the novelty wears off. The legs start talking. The pack feels heavier than when you left. The summit, wherever it is, stops feeling like an adventure and starts feeling like a commitment you should have thought harder about. I've been in that moment 100 times. I know what it looks like on people's faces. I saw it on some faces that day, around mile 7, on the eastern slope, when the path turned upward and the muscles began to negotiate with the will. But I was watching one face in particular. And on that face, I saw something different. What most people don't know, what didn't make it into the brief coverage the charity hike received in the press, is that the original plan had been a single day. 14 miles, one route, done. But the weather on the planned day had been assessed as marginal. Not dangerous, but uncertain enough that Fraser and his team had looked at the forecast the night before and made a judgment call. They moved it to a 2-day event. Day 1, 12 miles, finishing at a small mountain bothy, a simple stone shelter used by walkers in the Highlands, basic and spare, and exactly what a bothy is supposed to be. No electricity, a wood-burning stove, sleeping platforms with thin mattresses, water from a nearby burn. Day 2, the remaining 10 miles back down, with a more technical section added to the middle stretch. Specifically because the mountain rescue team wanted to demonstrate to supporters the kind of terrain their volunteers actually operate in. When the change was communicated to the palace, I'm told there was a brief discussion about whether the overnight element was appropriate. It was ultimately decided by the family, not the communications team, that it was not only appropriate but preferable. The boy would sleep in the bothy. He brought a sleeping bag rated to -10. He packed it himself. I know this because I asked Ailsa the following morning, standing outside the bothy in the 6 o'clock dark, our breath making small clouds, and she told me he'd arrived the previous afternoon with a pack that was noticeably more considered than those of some of the adults in the group. He had everything, she said. Head torch, emergency whistle, a map, actual paper, not just a phone, blister kit. He'd done his kit list properly. She sounded genuinely impressed. Some of the adults, she added diplomatically, had not. I want to spend some time here because this is the part of the story that nobody reported on. 7 of us stayed in the bothy that night, the boy, Ailsa, Fraser, 2 other rescue team members named Callum and M. Harry, a volunteer coordinator named Patrick, and me. The rest of the group had been brought down by vehicle as the day faded, partly for logistical reasons, and partly because the bothy sleeps 8 comfortably and 12 uncomfortably, and they were trying to make sensible decisions. The security arrangements for the bothy night were, frankly, impressive. I won't go into details because I don't entirely know them and I don't think I should speculate. What I will say is that the security presence was unobtrusive, thoughtful, the kind that exists without advertising itself. Inside the bothy we ate. Callum had carried in supplies not extravagant, just real food, proper calories. Rice and lentils cooked on a small camp stove, oatcakes, cheese, a flask of something warm. The wood-burning stove threw out a serious heat once it got going, which takes a while. And in the meantime we sat in jackets with our hands around mugs. The boy sat on the sleeping platform with his boots off, good blister management, I noticed. He'd aired his feet properly and ate everything in his bowl. Not quickly, but completely. No fussiness. The conversation around the stove was the kind you get when people are tired and warm and have earned it. Not performing, just talking. At one point, M. Harry, who has been with the mountain rescue team for 12 years, and who has the particular economy of speech you find in people who spend a lot of time in places that demand it, started talking about a winter rescue she'd been part of years earlier. A solo walker came off a ridge in a storm, broken ankle, hypothermia setting in. The team had been out for 14 hours. She talked about it simply, without drama. The cold, the narrow window of light they'd had, the decision points, what it felt like when they found him. The bothy was very quiet while she talked. The boy didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill silences, just listened with his whole body, that particular quality of attention where you can actually feel that someone is receiving what you're saying, not just waiting for their turn to speak. When M. Harry finished, he said, "Asterisk, how do you sleep after something like that? The night after a rescue like that?" She looked at him for a moment. "Sometimes you don't," she said. "First few times, you go over it, the decisions, what you might have done differently. Even when it worked out. Even when it worked out." He sat with that. "But then it gets easier," he said. "It wasn't really a question." "Different," she said. "It gets different, not easier. You just carry it differently." I wrote that down later, almost word for word, in the small notebook I carry. You just carry it differently. I've thought about it since in contexts that had nothing to do with mountain rescue. Outside the bothy at 6:15 in the morning, the sky was doing something extraordinary. The overnight cloud had cleared completely. You don't always get this. Sometimes the Highlands keep their cloud for days like a grudge, but that morning the sky was open and the stars were still visible in the west, fading slowly, and in the east there was the first pale line of October dawn, the hills silhouetted against it like cut paper. The boy was already outside when I emerged. He was standing about 20 yards from the bothy door, just looking at it. The sky, the dark shapes of the hills, the absolute silence. I thought about saying something, then I didn't. Some moments you don't narrate. I made tea on the stove. When I brought a mug out to him, he took it with a quiet thank you, and that was all. We stood there for a while, the two of us, watching the sky change. Somewhere below us in the valley we couldn't see, the world was already moving. People in cars, people on phones, people inside the machinery of ordinary life. Up here there was just the light coming and the cold, and the smell of the heather and the tea cooling in our hands. "It's different from down there, isn't it?" he said eventually. Not a question, an observation. "Very different," I agreed. "I think I needed that," he said, "to see what different feels like." He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. Day two's terrain was notably more demanding than day one's. Fraser had designed the route specifically to pass through a section of the cairngorms that mountain rescue teams operate in regularly. A narrow glen flanked by steep scree slopes, followed by a long traverse across loose rock, followed by a descent into forest that, even in clear conditions, requires navigation. By 9 in the morning, we were in the glen. The scree on the right-hand side had partially come down at some point in recent weeks. You could see the fresh broken rock, the lighter color of the exposed stone, and it had altered the path in that section. Fraser led us through it carefully, pointing out foot placements, explaining the logic. This is where the morning got serious. About 2/3 through the glen section, Callum, who was near the back of the group, called forward. His voice was calm. That particular rescuer's calm that is not absence of urgency but very precise management of it. He'd spotted something on the upper scree slope. A backpack, bright orange, wedged against a rock about 40 meters up. No person visible. The group stopped. Fraser got on the radio immediately. Quietly, methodically, running through the check sequence, reporting position, describing what they could see, requesting overwatch. The boy had stopped walking along with everyone else. He was watching Fraser on the radio, watching the slope. I could see his face working through something. He didn't speak, he didn't ask questions, he just waited. Within minutes it became clear, through the radio communication and through Callum and M. Harry beginning a careful traverse of the lower slope to get a better angle, that the backpack was likely debris from the earlier rockfall. Wind carried probably and snagged on the way down. No person, no emergency. The tension in the group released itself in the way these things do, not with a shout or a cheer, but just with a collective exhalation and the resumption of movement. Fraser completed his radio call, logged the position of the debris for follow-up, and turned back to the route. The boy fell into step beside him. "Does that happen a lot?" he asked. "Things that turn out to be nothing." "More than you'd think," Fraser said, "and you treat every one of them the same until you know. Because the one time you don't." "Lie." The boy nodded. That's the discipline of it, Fraser said. Not the heroics, the discipline. That exchange might be the most important thing I heard on those 2 days in the mountains. The traverse across the loose rock section was the most technically demanding part of the route. I want to be honest here. It scared me a little. I've done plenty of hill walking, but I'm not a technical mountaineer, and the combination of the exposure, a long, steep drop to the left, and the unstable surface required a level of concentration I found genuinely taxing. The group took it slowly. Fraser led, choosing the line with the expertise of someone who has done this thousands of times, calling back instructions. The pace was measured, deliberate. Midway across, there was a section where the rock had crumbled away from what had been, clearly, a more stable path. You had to step across a gap, maybe 2 feet wide, but with the slope below it, and then immediately find a secure footing on the other side. Fraser crossed first, then Harry, then Ailsa. Then the boy. He stood at the gap and looked at it. I was a few people behind him, watching. He looked at it the way you look at a maths problem, not with fear but with assessment. Where does the weight go? What does the foot do? Where's the other side? Then he stepped across. Clean, committed. No hesitation once the decision was made. On the other side, he turned and watched the next person cross. A young volunteer, late teens, who was visibly nervous. The boy said something to him from across the gap. I couldn't hear what, and the volunteer laughed despite himself, and then made the step. At the far end of the traverse, once everyone was across, Fraser did a head count. Everyone, all present. He looked at the boy. Good crossing, he said. Thank you for having me up here, the boy said. I mean that, really. Fraser, who has been leading rescues in these hills for over 2 decades, who has seen things on this mountain that most of us will never have to imagine, looked at this child for a moment with something in his face that I can only describe as recognition. The kind that passes between people who have both understood something true about a place. Come back, Fraser said, when you can. The final miles down through the forest were easy walking. Long-legged strides, the descent opening up the knees, the smell of pine coming back, that gentle relief that comes when the ground begins to level. The group talked more freely on the way down. The effort was behind us now, and something had loosened in everyone. I walked for a while near the boy and Ailsa. She was telling him about the youth program, young people from local schools who get introductory training with the rescue team, how it teaches them navigation, first aid basics, mountain sense, how some of them come back and eventually become volunteers themselves. Is there anything like that where you live? She asked him. That kind of program. He thought about it. There's outdoor education, but he paused, choosing his words carefully. It's not quite like this. It's not quite real in the same way. This is real, Ailsa agreed with some feeling. I'm going to remember this, he said, not for anyone in particular, just as a statement of fact. At the trailhead, there was a small gathering. The fundraising totals had been confirmed during the descent, via whatever means these things get confirmed, and the number was good, better than the target, significantly better in fact. The mountain rescue team coordinator, a compact woman named Jean who had the kind of calm authority that comes from years of making decisions in difficult situations, made the announcement, and there was genuine, warm applause. The thermal imaging cameras, the radio systems, the bivouac kits. People coming home. The boy stood and clapped with everyone else. Later I sat in my car in the car park and wrote up my notes. I had pages of them, details, fragments, moments. But I kept coming back to one image, one I hadn't written down because I'd been afraid writing it down would ruin it. The boy on day 1, standing at the cairn at the high point, looking out across the plateau while the cloud lifted. Not performing, not posing, just looking. A child at the edge of something vast, learning maybe for the first time that the world is bigger and quieter and more serious than the world he usually occupies, and finding in that bigness not fear, something closer to relief, the kind that comes when you discover that what you're standing on is solid, and the drop, though real, is one you can manage. The mountain asked something of him that day. He answered, "There's an old saying among mountain rescue volunteers that I heard for the first time from Fraser on the evening of day one, sitting by the stove in the bothy with our boots off and our tea going cold. The mountain doesn't care, and that's the point." He meant it as a practical thing, an instruction almost. The mountain's indifference to who you are or how important you think you are is not a cruelty. It's an equalizer. It strips you down to what you actually are. Not what you've been told you are, not what other people need you to be. Just what you are. I've been turning that over in my mind for weeks now. Because what I witnessed on those 2 days in the Cairngorms, what I watched that boy do, quietly, without announcement, on difficult ground in difficult weather, told me something I wasn't entirely expecting to discover. It told me what he is, and what he is going to be. The hike ended on a Thursday. By Friday morning, there was a brief statement from Kensington Palace confirming that the Prince of Wales's eldest son had participated in a charity fundraising event in the Cairngorms in support of the Mountain Rescue Service. The statement thanked the volunteers, noted the sum raised, and said that the prince had found the experience inspiring. That was it. No photographs released from the hike itself, a deliberate decision that I understand and respect. No press interviews, no social media content from official channels. The event was what it was, a real thing done for a real reason, not a content opportunity. The coverage it received in the press was brief and largely warm. A few outdoor magazines picked it up. A couple of Scottish papers ran short pieces noting the connection to the Cairngorm rescue team. The fundraising total was mentioned prominently, which was right. And then mostly, the world moved on. Which is, I think, exactly what was intended. But I couldn't move on quite as quickly, because I'd been there. I'd been on the ridge with him. I'd been in the bothy. I'd watched him cross that gap in the rock with the drop below and the cold wind coming through and the whole mountain watching, indifferent, the way the mountain always watches. I couldn't write it up as a quick paragraph. So I've been sitting with it, thinking about it. And now I want to try to say what I actually think, honestly, as someone who has spent a lot of time in wild places and who has watched a lot of different people encounter them. In the weeks after the hike, I spoke to several of the people who'd been there. Not for a formal piece, just conversations. I wanted to know what they'd seen from their vantage points. Fraser was characteristically direct. "He's physically capable," he said. "Good strength to weight, good coordination. More important, good judgment. He didn't overreach. He didn't try to prove anything. He assessed, he decided, he moved. That's rare. That's genuinely rare in anyone, never mind a kid." I asked if he'd been surprised. He thought about it. I'd been briefed that he'd done some outdoor education, walked in Wales, done some hills with his father, so I knew he wasn't completely green. He paused. But yes, the instinct of it, that surprised me a little. The instinct for the right action. You can't teach that. You either develop it in the ground or you don't. Harry was more personal. "The bothy night was what stuck with me," she said. "The way he listened. I've talked about that rescue, the one I told the story about that night. I've talked about it to a lot of people over the years. And most people, they respond to the drama of it, the heroics. They want to know about the dramatic moments." She paused. "He asked about the night after, what it does to you, the after part. She stopped. "That's what people who understand things ask." Ailsa was quieter about it. She's a measured person, not given to overstatement. "I liked him," she said simply, "as a person. He was good company on a hill, which is a real thing. Some people make the hill harder and some people make it easier, and he made it easier. He paid attention. He had a sense of humor that he didn't push too hard. He didn't make it about himself. She paused. I don't know what his life is going to ask of him, she said. I don't think anyone fully knows that, but whatever it asks, I think he'll try to meet it properly. That much I can say. This matters. I don't want to lose it in everything else. The hike raised, in total, enough to fully fund the Cairngorm Mountain Rescue Team's equipment update program for the next 2 years. 2 thermal imaging cameras, one for winter operations, one held in reserve. 4 upgraded radio systems compatible with the current emergency services network. 30 new emergency bivouac kits, the kind that fit in a jacket pocket and can maintain a person's body temperature long enough to keep them alive while help reaches them. Updated first aid training for all active volunteers. These are not abstract numbers. These are the things that close the gap between a body found and a person brought home. The difference in the narrowest moments between yes and no. The rescue team's coordinator, Jean, sent me a note after the event. She's not someone who uses a lot of words when fewer will do. She wrote, "We've been trying to fund this kit replacement for 3 years. 3 years of applications and grant forms and committee decisions. One morning on a hill with a boy who actually cared, and we're done. I think about that. I think about it too." About a month after the hike, I received a call from the Mountain Rescue Team's communications officer. She told me that the team had received a handwritten letter. She wanted to tell me about it because she knew I'd been covering the event. She read me parts of it. Not all of it, some of it, she said, felt private, but parts. The letter thanked the team for having him, said that he'd thought about the hike a great deal since coming home, said that Harry's story about the rescue had stayed with him, the part about carrying it differently, specifically. He said he thought that was true about a lot of things. He said he hoped he'd be the kind of person who carries things well. He asked if he could come back, not for an event, just to walk, to learn more. At the bottom of the letter, in careful handwriting, he'd written the total amount the hike had raised, and then below it, "I hope this helps bring someone home." Jean framed it. It's on the wall of the rescue team's equipment room in Aviemore, next to the thermal imaging cameras. I went back to that section of the Cairngorms in November. By myself, this time, no event, no group. Just me and a full pack and a good forecast and a day I had free. I walked the ridge section again. Different weather, clearer, colder, the kind of November day where the light is silver and thin and the shadows long and blue. The ridge felt different on my own. Bigger, more serious. The wind was up again and I could see for miles the whole plateau, the distant cairns, the shapes of the eastern Cairngorms fading into haze. I stopped at the place where we'd stopped as a group, where the boy had stood and looked out. I stood there for a while. Thought about what Fraser had said, the mountain doesn't care, and that's the point. And I thought about what it might mean to grow up already knowing that. To understand, at 10 or 11 years old, that there are places in this world that will not acknowledge your name or your title or your bloodline. That will simply present you with their own reality and wait to see what you do with it. And to go to those places anyway, deliberately, not with cameras and announcements and the machinery of image management, but with a sleeping bag rated to -10 and a paper map and a blister kit. To go and say, "Here I am, tell me what you know." On my way back down from the ridge, I passed a group of walkers going up. A family, mother, father, 2 kids. The younger one was having a hard time. Not dangerously, just tired, as kids get. The legs going on strike somewhere between the ambition of the morning and the reality of the afternoon. The father was being patient, pointing out things to look at. A buzzard turning on a thermal high above. The particular shape of a summit, the way it changed as you approached it. The mother had dropped back with the child and was talking quietly, one hand on the small shoulder. And the older kid, maybe 9, maybe 10, had walked back down the path from where he'd gotten ahead and was standing waiting, saying nothing, just present, ready to carry on together when everyone was ready. A small thing. But the mountain notices small things. I filed my piece eventually, shorter than this, tidier, the kind of thing that fits in a magazine. But this is the version I wanted to write. The longer one. The one with the bothy and the dawn and the traverse and the gap in the rock and the letter on the wall of the equipment room. The version that tries to say what I actually saw. I saw a child take a mountain seriously. I saw a mountain take him back. And somewhere in that exchange, in the cold and the wind and the 14 miles and the bothy night and the letter written in careful handwriting, something was decided. Not by the palace, not by the press, not by the endless apparatus of royal life that surrounds and shapes and sometimes smothers. By the boy himself, on his own 2 feet, on ground that didn't care who he was. And that was everything.